David, thanks for joining me today for our Theology Unchained series, part of the Thinking Faith project. So, David, can I begin by asking you to tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Prince, for inviting me to this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. So my name is David Lapano. I teach at a theological school in Canada, in Winnipeg. And that is a school that primarily trains folks for diaconal ministry in the Anglican Church of Canada and the United Church of Canada. And it has a history going back to the 19th century, where it primarily trained deaconesses. Oh. But in the more recent years, it trains folks of all genders, and its tradition is primarily in feminist theology and contextual theology and liberation theology. And the style of teaching is an action reflection model. So there's a lot of experiential learning, people like setting goals and reflecting on it and working together in community to help each other towards their the readiness for ministry. So they do teaching. I teach in a classroom, but this month I'll be teaching online. But also students have field placement, so it's very integrated. So that's what I do. Before that, I was working on a PhD at Oxford in philosophical theology. And my dissertation, my research area is focusing on the theology of the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. And I was really interested, as many people are now, about the social and political implications of his theology. So that's what has interested me. And then, of course, all of the kinds of theology and philosophy and social theory that kind of circles around those questions of how does theology impact our social lives, and how has history impacted theology?
Oh, that's really helpful, David. And you mentioned Søren Kierkegaard. Mm-hmm. And I remember our conversation in the past. He also mentioned there's a big name in the UK, a guy who also did his PhD on Søren. And he's called, I hope I remember his name. He's called
Stephen Backhouse.
Stephen Backhouse, absolutely.
Right,
yeah, I don't know why I keep forgetting Stephen Backhouse. And you know Stephen.
I know Stephen. We met in Oxford, and we've met since then. There's several other. A professor at King's College named Claire Carlyle is another Kierkegaard scholar. Stephen Shakespeare in Liverpool he has done lots of interesting work on Kierkegaard. And George Pattison, who was my supervisor, he's in Glasgow. And there's in Oxford, Joel Rasmussen. There's quite a few people in the UK who are, I've only named a few, but there's quite a number of people who are really inspired and creatively working with Kierkegaard.
Oh, thanks, David. As you know, I'm particularly interested in political theology myself. And the reason for this interview is going to be quite focused on political theology, what it means, and how Christians can engage their imaginations around the political implication of the Christian faith, and perhaps touch a little bit on what that may mean in our current health crisis. I have had a lot of Christians come up to me, and both online and in person, and sometimes after I've given a sermon, they will say, "Why are you overly political in your sermon? Politics and religion, or politics and faith, they don't mix." I always say to them what the famous Archbishop Desmond Tutu said to people who made similar challenge towards him. And I said to them, "What sort of Bible have you been reading?" Them that question, because I think that the Christian faith, or religion, in fact, is political. And when you look back in antiquity, or even beyond that, you will find that ancient people, they never made these distinctions that we make today in terms of politics, state, and religion. So there's no dichotomy as such between faith and politics. So, and Easter is central to the Christian faith. And to repeat what Apostle Paul said, without the resurrection, our Jesus story is finished completely in Corinthians, I think 15. And I put out a lot of reflection, very, very kind of little soundbite reflections on my social media pages and again to the Theology Unchained pages. And some of these little reflection got people asking questions, got people questioning again, why are you always mixing politics with faith and religion? And I'm going to read you some of these posts, and then we'll go into the meat of the discussion. I started by saying, the vindication of the Son of God, Easter is God's emphatic yes to Jesus and no to the imperial power that killed him. And that didn't go down well, exactly. I mean, some people didn't like it. What's he on about? Some didn't understand what I was talking about, but majority did understand. Why is he being political again? Then I went, the second quote was, the second reflection was, resurrection and eschatology go hand in hand. It means that God's great cleanup of the world has begun and that we've got a job to do. And I said to people, grab your broom and packer and brushes, let's join in the Jesus movement until the glory of God covers the earth just as the waters cover the sea. I think that's Habakkuk. And I said again, we must not over-spiritualize or over-personalize the Easter story by overlooking its political implications. The Easter story invites adherents to confront injustice today, because I think that the same power that killed Jesus is still alive and kicking today. So I encourage people and I urge them to not to be complacent, because it's not over until it is over. Now, the final one, I know you're probably going to start getting bored of it, but the final one is, and I said, seriously, without Easter, our Jesus story is over, as I mentioned earlier. And I said that Easter says that Christians are not just mere utopian dreamers. Easter is a judgment on injustice. Otherwise, Christianity would have been about the next world, and this world belonging only to the wealthy and the most powerful. Now, thinking up through all these soundbite reflections that I've bombarded my social media followers with during the Easter period, can I start by asking you, David, to define political theology for us? You may want to define politics, and then define theology, and then define political theology altogether. You are the expert. It's up to you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, I think political theology, it has several meanings. And for some, political theology is a very specific kind of academic investigation that kind of comes out of a critical theory as well. So it's really linked historically with even Marxist and leftist and critical theory from the 19th and 20th century, and how theology takes some of those questions and basically thinks about how God is implicated in those questions, right? So that's a very specific kind of political theology, and for some people that's a bit like that's too political. It's too it seems too worldly because it's so connected with some of these more secular thinkers. But what the theologians would say is actually those questions that the secular theorists are asking are questions that are spirit-filled and that are actually there's a tradition of those kinds of questions being asked in Scripture. So the prophets would be confronting the powers in much the same way and confronting their own society in much the same way. So for some theologians, they say, look, we recognize that there is a secular tradition of asking these kinds of questions, but it's also in the religious tradition too, and so we're going to engage in that. But another way to think about political theology, I think, is also contextual theology. So that's really popular as well, and that's really broad. And contextual theology is basically saying, look, what matters is the situation, the historical and the lived situation that we find ourselves in, which is actually very different. So, someone who's living in Brazil with its particular history, is going to ask theological questions and think about how to work through them in a way that might be slightly different from someone who's in Japan or someone who's in England or someone who's in Canada. And so it means that the context of those experiences, whether it's, and I just named the kind of national locations, but it could also be identity, it could be people's experience in their race, in their sexuality, in their class, that these have an impact on how we work through the questions of theology, the questions of who is God, who are we, and what is our task. The way we go through those questions is potentially different depending on our context, and those ends up being political, because it's about how we engage with our social and historical surroundings. So I think often thinking about contextual theology as political theology is really helpful. And I think that's what most people in theology and in active ministry are doing. Another way to think about it too is that often religion and theologians are thought of as like asking those ultimate questions. What is the meaning of life and death? And what is the nature of God? And these ultimate questions. That's what kind of Tillich said. These ultimate questions. And while that's important and it's part of the task of theology, what matters is how the answers to those questions impact our lived experience and our social experience. And that's when it becomes political. So what do I mean by political? Basically, anything or any set of relationships that impacts on our social, economic, and our societal lives. So how we organize our societies, that's political. And if our religious communities are going to be in society, we're going to have to think how that impacts the politics and how the political world impacts theology. That's my kind of off the top response to that. Yeah.
That is beautiful. I've really learned a great deal from that response. Thank you so very much, David. In light of what you've said, it seems to me that engaging in politics is inevitable for every human being, let alone Christians. So do you think that a priest should be involved in politics, or do you think that a priest should hold political views?
Yeah, so I guess the question here is, how to relate to one's role as a priest, how to relate to the congregation, and how to relate to broader society. And because I think that as a human being, you're going to have a politics, just like we all have a theology. I think we also all have a politics, and they're intertwined. If we think we can separate the two, I think we're kidding ourselves a little bit. So our politics and our theology is intertwined, because as you said in the beginning, in earlier parts of history, we didn't have such a clear dichotomy between the political and the religious, or the secular and the religious. They were more integrated. And even though there have been reasons in modern history to try to, delineate, to kind of separate those, actually they still remain very integrated, because it's part of how we make meaning or make sense of the world. So a priest is going to have a politics, just as a priest has a theology. And the question for every priest to answer for themselves is, how how they're able to communicate gospel in such a way that honors their integrity of their own faith, but also that allows for space in their congregations and in their communities to come to their own understanding of who God is, who we are, and what is our task. So what I think that means in terms of answering your question is that, yes, I think a priest can put forth their own ideas. There has to be a way of inviting people to kind of self-interrogate their own theology and their own politics. So I think it could be, I can imagine the temptation for myself too would be, there are times when I want to say, this is where we should be going in a kind of political question, right? Mm-hmm. And there would be times where maybe it's important to kind of pave a clear way. And I'm thinking of, people don't normally think of Karl Barth as a political theologian, right? But his epistle to the Romans is a very strong piece of political theology, and he's calling the church to account in a time when he can see that nationalism, and he can see what's coming, the kind of catastrophe that that the World War II leads to, and he's saying to the church, we cannot be aligned with this kind of worldly power. So he's not saying, here's the party I'm voting for, here's what you should vote for, or whatever, but he is definitely making political statements. And so I think, the priest has that responsibility in times, but also has to acknowledge and allow for the integrity of a broad set of views, and so has to find a way to let his or her or their community interrogate their own views, and so that people come to their understanding with integrity, and that's a difficult thing to do. I mean, that's the challenge of leadership, is how to kind of show a vision, but not overstate your own view. And it really, I'm sure 10 different theologians would express how much of a challenge this is, really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, David. That's very important. I think the message I'm getting is a priest ought to have political and share political opinion, but in a way that it invites people to interrogate and question their own politics, and in a way that is not particularly partisan. Is that what?
Yes, and then I have to qualify that by, so if I'm going to be honest with myself too, I do subscribe to the theology of the preferential option of the poor. Yeah. Which is language that was used, in the 20th century kind of liberation theology. Which is that, God makes God's self known and really close to those who are marginalized, despised, dispossessed in society, and that we learn something true about who God is and what our life together ought to be when we listen to and follow the lead of the marginalized, rather than the more dominant powers of more dominant political powers, economic powers, military powers. That those expressions of life lead us away from God more so than if we follow and think about what it means to be aligned with or to find justice for the marginalized and dispossessed. So in that sense, I guess I am partisan. Like, not every politics is life affirming,
Mm-hmm.
and not every politics really honors the life of all. And so I think I would, I think this is where scripture and theology does the work of showing this, where God really lifts up the life of what the powerless, and really challenges the narratives of military, economic, and political dominance.
Absolutely. And I think because when I was thinking when I asked that question, hang on a second, Jesus wasn't particularly neutral. He took sides, and I know what side he was on, and still he is on. And I will clearly associate his side with the preferential option for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
And he took side. He was for the marginalized. He was for the poor and the less privileged and the less able. He took sides.
Mm-hmm.
How would you respond, David, to Christians who have no faith in politics today, and they think, no matter what we do, no matter how much we try, politics is not going to change, but we just better relax and focus on worshiping God, and then prepare for the life after death, because this world is not the place. And they often probably quote, even though I think they misquote or misinterpret John's gospel, I think, where he talked about I can't remember, but I think John, when Jesus Christ was speaking about taking his disciples away from the world, and that they are not of this world, but of the world. And in my view, there are different ways to interpret that, but I have seen that particular passage mishandled. So yeah, some Christians quote that, and they say, we don't have faith in politics. Politics cannot save. Only Christ can save, and this is going to happen when at the second coming, or when Christ takes them away from it, or at rapture. So what would be your response to those skeptic Christians who doesn't particularly believe in politics, or they are any that they could make an impact in politics?
Yeah, I mean, when faced with questions like that, first of all, it's not easy, because I understand that feeling of feeling disenfranchised or disillusioned with politics, and people feeling like they can't impact the kind of large scale game of politics that's going on in the world, that they can vote, but really it's almost like it's inevitable what the outcomes are going to be. So I understand that feeling. But the other side of it, which is this Christian belief that, okay, so that means all I should care about is my personal salvation, or the salvation of my community, and worrying about my life in heaven afterwards. I think that I would ask them, like, what do you love? What are the things that you love? And if they start to name more than 2 or 3 things, I mean, several of those are going to be very tangible, concrete, either people or things or places that really bring them a lot of joy, or that connect them to others, or that connect them to God. And as soon as you start to talk about the concrete and the tangible, then we end up saying, okay, so how do we build the world where we can have those relationships, and have those spaces, and have the things that we need? I'm not talking about consumerism, like just stuff, but like having the things that we need, that have meaning and value, and that bring us closer to others and closer to God. And then also start asking the questions like, what, do we have any role in building this world? And I would also look for examples in scripture and in theology that emphasize that humans are not just creatures that sit and wait for God to do God's work, but that God has, in a sense, ordained us. I hope that's okay language, but in a sense, ordained us to be co-workers with God. And what covenant means in the Hebrew scriptures too is not just like a transaction, but that now God and the people of God are bound together in a common task of being in partnership, being in treaty, being in relationship, and actually being in love. And that means being accountable to each other. So the people of God need to be accountable to God, and that means we actually have to, do things in this world that demonstrate that we are, loving the world as much as God loves the world.
I think that reminds me so much of what I think St. Augustine puts it very beautifully when he said, "We without God cannot, and God without us will not."
Yeah, exactly. So there's a real partnership, and so God can, like, so in that phrase by Augustine, it acknowledges that God is not dependent on creation to act, but God invites us and calls us to act, and with that, God acts too. With our activity, God acts with us. So it's an invitation, but it's an invitation that, we have to be really careful about whether we would deny that gift, because it's a responsibility too. I think another kind of theological point is that our life depends on responding to God's call to action. We can't just imagine that if we sit by ourselves and just wait, that everything will be fine. Like we, just kind of put ourselves in our rooms or in our small communities and just sit and wait and try to like fend off all the evil worldly ways, that's enough. Really, God calls us to act in the world, to really understand ourselves deeply, to understand each other, and to love deeply, which means doing stuff.
And that is deeply incarnational. I don't know how much you know about incarnational theology, but that is deeply incarnational. That is God collaborating with humanity to achieving God's purposes on. So that is really material.
Yeah.
Overly abstract and spiritualized. And when I talk about people over spiritualizing the material aspect of the eschatology, as it were, or again, I'm using technical terms here, but the material aspect of God, in this God's manifestation, God's presence in our present world, people often think that somehow I'm anti-spirituality. I am not. I think it is a sign of spiritual health. Someone who is spiritually healthy is one who is actively involved in the material world, changing it for good, winning every single bit and piece of the world for God. I think. Then you may I don't know what you will say about people like Desmond Tutu, who was particularly active politically, bringing to bear God's justice to during the apartheid South Africa. What might we learn from Desmond Tutu and people like
Oscar Romero is another person.
Romero, even Bonhoeffer, and Mahatma Gandhi even, and there are loads of other people that I personally would regard as political theologians. What might Christians learn from these great figures?
Yeah, I think, well, what I learned from those figures is that the best way to do theology is to live it. So, I think it's an important vocation for some theologians to to reflect on things and to write books, and that the rest of us could read them and think about them and learn something. But there's a point where the rubber hits the road, as they say, and it's so how do we put that theology into practice? And actually, it's not even a matter of like first we do a theory, I think about it, and then now I'm going to go outside and see if I can try it. It's not an experiment. What these theologians do is they say, God calls me to this world, and there's a need in this world. There are many needs in this world, and I go out there and I try to live the truth as much as I can, and acknowledging that I might stumble and fall. But I live that truth, and then in that practice, then the theology emerges. So it's not the other way around, that we kind of design our theology and then we go out and try it. But actually, in the practice of living what we learn in our faith communities, and being in the world and actually trying to love neighbors and trying to challenge the powers, that in those actions, that's when theology emerges too. And that's hopefully how the kingdom will form.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you've just used a word a phrase that is reminiscent to Martin Luther King Jr. in during the civil rights movement. He would you consider him a political theologian?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because his task wasn't to write a new systematic theology. His task was to change the laws and the ways of life in the American society, and it was very contextual. He recognized a need for liberation all over the world, but his task was really here's our situation and it has to change. And then as time went on too, he saw how that was connected with South Africa, with the Vietnam War and other parts of the world. Yeah.
I mean, I did say something recently. I said that these people, some of these greatness we mentioned, they were loyal to God and was not going to bow down to the idols of lesser good or idols of complacency or collaboration with evil, or even the idol of just sitting down and just doing nothing and watching, because silence obviously means taking sides. And they were determined to throw spanner in the works of the normalcy of civilization. I mean, the normalcy of domination and unjust systems. And if any Christian hearing this says, that's really the Christian call, I would consider them political theologians, or I would consider them political. Mm-hmm. And if they believe that this is actually Christian, then politics and religion or faith, in some ways, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think there is a parallel. I mean, they are simultaneously, they walk hand in hand simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I agree, because I think ultimately religious life in any faith is about transformation. It's about assessing our lives where we are and hearing a call to change to something new. Mm-hmm. So that will require any kind of transformation. If it's personal and if it's social, is going to require some kind of political engagement. And I think this is where, if we want to talk about secular politics separate from religion, I think that's where it's honest and has integrity too. It is about transformation. Most politics want to see a new way for a future. For some politicians, that means an entirely new way, something entirely new. For others, the new way is let's build on the traditions of the past and keep them going. Exactly. But in any case, it's about transforming society, and therefore allowing people to be transformed. And I think that's a religious move. It's a religious motivation to look for transformation.
So would you consider Christianity as a political force? in that it presents or offers an alternative society?
Well, I think it's a political force for good and for bad. So basically, we have to say that it is a political force. Historically, it has been, at least since the kind of Constantinian, empire era, it has been a force of political domination, and it has been aligned with economic, military, and political power. So it is it has been and it is political in that way. I think especially in Europe and North America, it still holds, even though church attendance might be decreasing and people's professed faith might be changing or decreasing in kind of what would be considered conventional or traditional ways. The church itself still holds a place of privilege. It has property and wealth and political, avenues for political influence. So it is political in that way, in the sense of like it actually is it is aligned with the powers. But it's also political in the way that you were saying of like offering something new. I mean, I don't think that Christianity or the church has necessarily offered a specific program, like a kind of political manifesto. But what it does when we go through the church year, and we kind of recount the Christian, like the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian narratives, and talking about Easter, like we are compelled to think about how God makes things new, how God is committed to creation and to renewing creation if we will be co-workers, partners with God. And so in that sense, I think it's a religion of life, it's not a death cult. And it's not ambivalent. It's not a theory or ideology that's just like some kind of like abstract model. It's not ambivalent. It's very interested in the life of creation. So it calls us into a politics in that way as well. So it has these two. I mean, Christianity as a historical reality right now has these two sides to it, which is that it does have the legacy of empire and military, economic, and political domination, which is still, I mean, to deny that is felt around the world is delusional, I would say. And it also has the more insurgent and transformational and liberative components to it. So, it's a mixed bag right now.
Yes,
but that means that Christians have to kind of struggle through where they see themselves. Do Christians align themselves with the theology of glory and power, or do Christians align themselves with the theology of liberation and transformation?
That's really very helpful, David. And as we were speaking, I was thinking, remembering somebody in when I was training for ordination, who did mention that I think he said that being politically active has consequences, and some of the reason why some Christians avoid the radical political engagement with the world, using their faith and politics together. Do you think, I can see sense in that, given the way Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King, and many other victims of political dominance, and when they try to engage the world with their faith. Do you think that there is still risk for Christians who might want to engage in politics today, and maybe perhaps these risks prevent them from doing so?
Mm-hmm. I think the risks are different in different places in the world. I wouldn't want to diminish some of the real danger that some Christians experience in parts of the world where Christianity is at the moment is a minority faith in a kind of hostile environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important to recognize that that is a real experience for many Christians. For many other Christians in the world, in where it has been part of the history of more dominant political and economic power, Christianity is not persecuted in the same way as other faiths are. But I don't think that's what you're talking about. You're asking, like, if I think there's something about, like, what Bonhoeffer talked about the cost of discipleship. And this is something that Kierkegaard was also really keen to talk about too, is that, to kind of live a genuinely Christian life it would mean coming into conflict with the established powers, or with the kind of worldly powers of political, economic, and military might. And so there's a question that these theologians put to Christians, especially in Europe, which is that if you think that you're being Christian, but your life is pretty easy, then you're missing something. And this is, this is a challenge that I think about for myself, because I don't think I've really taken the cost of discipleship entirely seriously. I think that if I were to really engage a bit more, then I would come up against hardship. And here the key is not to, like, romanticize suffering, or to be like, oh, like I have to create a situation where I'm in desperation, or I'm in trouble, or I'm in danger, and then that's how I know. It's not about that. I think it's more that if we live according to the gospel message of really loving the neighbor, if we kind of follow the prophetic voices in Hebrew scriptures of creating a just world for the whole community, and really challenging the power structures that like to kind of consolidate their power, then that's going to mean coming into conflict with power. And we can't expect that coming into conflict with power is going to be a gentle exercise.
Not at all.
It's going to have some challenges. So I think one ought to expect that the Christian life is both full of joy, but also full of trial.
Thank you. That brings me to my next question, and I've got a few more minutes to go, about 5 or 6 minutes. So, does political agitation, particularly nonviolent political agitation, does it work?
I think it does. And so, how do I put this? Like, it's interesting in this time of the pandemic, when governments around the world are making very quick decisions to find ways to support either institutions like the NHS, or individuals who are all of a sudden laid off, and to think about, what are some ways we can protect people's housing when they're in desperate situations. All of these things that the governments are doing because they see themselves in kind of exceptional times, these are things that people have been calling for years, decades, and even longer. And the way that people call for them has often been through political agitation. And it might be the case that, some governments in parliament eventually, write up some laws and pass them, and then we can all say, oh, this was done very gently and nicely. But the reality is that behind all those laws are people either in like it's collections of individuals or unions who are putting pressure on politicians, and they do it by political agitation. So that eventually people in political power say, okay, yeah, we got to do something because people are getting angry. And sometimes it's kind of smooth like that. Sometimes it's a bit more radical. I mean, I think you could take empire as an example. The colonies, the British colonies, many of them that were so-called liberated by the British, say, okay, we'll grant you your freedom. The story that's told is that the British granted freedom to these, but in many of these places, the colonized themselves said, no, we're not happy with this, and they would fight, and they would make a mess of things. They would burn their crops. They would fight back, and eventually it became too much of a pain for the British to maintain this. And so then that's when it happened. So political agitation is the real story behind a lot of these liberation movements.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then again, you touched on sometimes violence is inevitable during political agitation. But people like Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, and in fact, in my view, Jesus, they were ruthlessly committed to nonviolent political agitation.
This is the highest ideal, I think, is to find ways to show power's weakness. This is the real magic trick, of some of these people, is to show the weakness of these kinds of displays of power, to show that military and economic domination and control actually is really a kind of weakness, and that true strength is more shown in the kind of ways of living that these people demonstrate, and they're inspired by their religious leaders, like like the sages or the prophets or Christ himself. And so that's where the nonviolent resistance shows that kind of ideal. Now, I think that's what we want to find, ways of transforming the world without, bloodshed. Exactly. because I can't imagine that is God's hope for the world. But I also understand, when we look at history, I understand that power doesn't just sit down and say, okay, I was wrong. Freedom will be yours. It often takes a real struggle and a real push. And so I understand the more radical approaches, and they have a sense and a logic to them. But my hope is for the kinds of struggle that can, with nonviolence, can show the weakness of power, of dominating power.
That is beautiful. I think it kind of summarizes almost or encapsulates what Daniel Berrigan, another powerful non-violent figure in Christian history, especially, I think he was a Jesuit priest. He said a revolution is interesting insofar as it avoids, like the plague it promised to heal. Isn't that powerful? And this brings me to the question I was going to ask about the connection we might make with the resurrection and the nonviolent resistance. So when you talk about how nonviolence resistance is a great ideal, and it kind of shows the weakness of power and violence, might there be a lesson from the resurrection story, from the Easter story, for Christians in regards to nonviolent political resistance?
Yeah, I think the kind of main political message that I get from the resurrection is that and it's the language that you use at the beginning of saying yes. So that God says yes to life and says yes to creation, and that as even as we in creation, something as creatures have a tendency, or we succumb to our weakness and our desire for violence, that God will not allow that to be ultimate. That God is committed to transforming even our violence and our desire to harm, and our fear, because that comes from a fear, that God is willing to bring life and give life to us ultimately. And so the challenge is to recognize that commitment to life, that commitment to transformation, before we get to the point where we think that violence is the only is the answer. But I mean, violence is tricky because there's violence all around us. I mean, that's what the Easter story tells us, is that violence is kind of deeply in our history and our social lives, and that even when confronted with God, sometimes our response to that bewilderment or confusion or fear or just unable to meet the call is to even face God with violence. And it's sad. But yeah, I think maybe, it'd almost be worth having another entire conversation about violence.
Violence, exactly.
Violence in theology, because it's a really challenging thing. Because while nonviolence is the ideal, the problem is that in our world which contains violence, the question is who has the strength or who has the resolve for nonviolence. Unfortunately, the domineering and dominant powers don't restrain themselves. So they're happy to use violence as a way of... It's interesting, even in the Roman times, in order to have the peace, the Pax Romana, that was, in order to have peace, that was...
Yeah, it was through violence, isn't it?
It was through violence, right. So,
yeah.
So it's a paradox, or not, it's not a paradox, it's a contradiction in there.
But I do think that the Easter story is powerful in that it actually, as you said earlier, made a mockery of Pax Romana, really. Because what Christ did, in my view, is obviously not violently. You saw that on Palm Sunday, he mounted on a colt, a donkey on a colt. That is, again, Matthew referencing Zechariah, the peaceful Messiah who wouldn't want to be like the traditional Messiah who would come with violence and all that. He mounted a non-violent protest on that particular day. And you could tell that it was non-violent because the Romans are good at, when they want to round up violent agitators, they kind of round up their followers and get them all crucified. But in this case, Jesus Christ's followers were not rounded up. So because he was just a non-violent agitator, and that was why Pilate was very skeptical, was really reluctant in terms of condemning to death. But ultimately, obviously religion collaborating with power got this guy murdered on the cross. But the resurrection here, for me, made a mockery of violence and confirmed Jesus Christ's, alternative approach to changing the world, to bringing peace in the world. It's not Pax Romana. It can happen through peaceful agitation, even if it means giving your life, even if it means unto death. And that resurrection is so powerful that it says God has the final say. Peace, even unto death, because there is a hope of bodily resurrection. And the Easter story for me, captures this alternative political agitation, which is rooted in nonviolent resistance. Because in the end, God wins, and it shows and makes a mockery of evil and violence.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so very much for your time, and I wish you God's speed and God's protection in these trying times, and I pray the same for your family. So thank you, David, and I hope to speak to you soon again.
Thank you, Prince. It was lovely to chat with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Now, take care.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.